Prime Minister Modi has just completed a historic and highly productive visit to three important nations in the Indo Pacific. Over the last 5 days, the Prime Minister has visited Indonesia, Australia, and New Zealand. All the three visits have yielded some very significant outcomes that could reshape India's foreign policy. These visits will enhance India's Act East policy and redefines the Mahasagar doctrine. So, in this video, let's understand the significance of these visits, why these three countries are so critical for India's Indo Pacific vision. Let's talk about all the major outcomes in complete detail so that it could be relevant for both prelims and the mains examination. We will also analyze how these visits will upgrade the Act East policy of India and further the relations with Southeast and East Asian countries and as well as towards the Pacific region and redefine the Mahasagar doctrine. We will also carry out a critical assessment of the challenges that lie ahead for India and how India can navigate these challenges. So let's start with some basics. When you look at the Indo Pacific region, you need to know that this region is the global focal point of today's geopolitics, especially since the end of the Cold War. The Indo Pacific has risen both in economic terms and strategic terms. Because prior to the end of the Cold War, the Atlantic Ocean was the epicenter of all the big economic and geopolitical developments. Because that is where all the major powers were concentrated in North America, in Europe. But post Cold War, this global focal point of geopolitics has shifted eastwards with the rise of Asian economies such as China, India, Southeast Asian countries. And today, this region carries nearly 60% of the global trade, with more than 40% of global energy supplies passing through the Indo Pacific. And the region is also home to some choke points, such as the Malacca Strait, on which India and the countries of this region are heavily dependent upon. This region is also dominated by major global powers, including the United States, and as well as Japan, Australia, and of course, China and India on the other side. Now, in the Indo Pacific, India has some key interests to access the markets in Southeast and East Asia region, to promote our strategic and military influence far beyond the Pacific, towards the South Pacific as well, and towards the Arctic region, towards the Russian peninsula. So, India has a wide ranging set of interests in this region. India would like to stabilize the movement of vessels and aircraft to protect freedom of navigation and overflight. India would like to enforce the rules based world order. India would like to ensure a free and open Indo Pacific. But for this vision of India, there are multiple challenges. The first major challenge is from China's aggression in the region. China's territorial claims in South China Sea and China's continued military and diplomatic aggression is something that disrupts freedom of navigation and overflight. China's refusal to follow the rules based order directly challenges India's belief in multilateralism. The second challenge comes from the United States, particularly under Donald Trump. Recently, the US has renamed the Indo Pacific Command, which is headquartered in Hawaii, as the Pacific Command, which probably indicates the changing perception within the US strategic establishment and how US may not consider India as a key component of its strategy to counter China in the region. Because since 2009 2010, India has been under the assumption that US would be one of the closest reliable partners to stabilize this region. And the renaming of the Pacific Command to Indo Pacific back then was seen as a sign, a signal towards the growing prominence and relevance of India. Because the Indo Pacific Command, which has now been renamed as the Pacific Command, it exercised its jurisdiction until the coastline of India. So, this essentially made India one of the center points of the Indo Pacific, one of the key pillars of this region to bring that balance and to counter any threats from piracy to terrorism to China's military and diplomatic aggression. But now, under Donald Trump, the US is most likely carrying out a reorientation. It has even sidelined the Quad or the Quadrilateral that had brought four major democracies of Indo Pacific together. which was seen as a counterbalance to Chinese aggression in the Indo Pacific, specifically in the South China Sea. India has been waiting to even host the Quad summit for the past 2+ years. So, given these changing foreign policy priorities of the US under Donald Trump and the new bonhomie which has developed between Trump and Xi Jinping, there is a fear within the Indian strategic circle that would US allow China to carve out its own sphere of influence? Because if you look at the new national security strategy of the US, it talks about establishing American predominance in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas region. And this could be interpreted as US making space for China in the Eastern Hemisphere, where China would probably be allowed to exercise its influence and dominance across the Indo Pacific as long as it doesn't bother American interests in the Western Hemisphere. Trump has even spoken about the so called G2 involving US and China to deal with global issues. So, such a new colonial world order, if at all it were to take shape, would it would be detrimental to Indian interests in the Indo-Pacific. So India is closely watching these developments. So there is a need to counter China to ensure that we have alternate balancing powers without depending too much on the US. At the same time, India is also seeking market access across the Indo-Pacific to increase its exports, to secure imports of key minerals and key raw materials. India would like to secure its energy supplies and supply chains of critical minerals and key ingredients that are required for the Indian economy. India would also like to streamline mobility to enable the movement of Indian students, Indian professionals who are legally migrating to these countries and creating opportunities for both sides. So, India has a number of economic, strategic, and military priorities, and that is why the Indo Pacific is absolutely critical for our interests. So, in this context, the visit to Indonesia, Australia, and New Zealand acquires a lot of significance. So, before we talk about the outcomes in detail, I have an important announcement for UPSC aspirants. Unacademy will be conducting India's biggest civil services championship test tomorrow on the 12th of July at 11 a.m. and 5 p.m. This scholarship test will give you a chance to win attractive rewards up to 40 crores. And the first ranker will get a chance to win a tablet, and with the others getting a chance to win Amazon gift vouchers. Those of you who will take up the scholarship test will also win attractive scholarships for our IAS courses. So if you're interested, do check out the details by clicking on the link provided in the description and enroll immediately because today is the last day to enroll. Now, coming back to our discussion, let us start with Indonesia. Let's see why Indonesia is critical for India's interests, how Indonesia has been a priority since 1947 till date, and what position does it occupy under the Look East Act East policy of India, and what were the key outcomes during the Prime Minister's visit. See, Indonesia, which became free from colonial rule, it has always shared a common interest and a common cause with India. Back then, Prime Minister Nehru actually played a role in assisting and enabling Indonesia's freedom struggle against Dutch colonization. India, Indonesia say they shared a similar global vision and they became the founding members of the NAM, the Non Aligned Movement. They both laid the foundation for a new third ideology in a world that was divided between the communist bloc led by Soviet Union and the Western democratic capitalist bloc led by the United States. So India, along with Indonesia, along with Yugoslavia, Ghana, and Egypt, they created a new world order with the non-aligned movement. So, from decades, India Indonesia enjoy very close relations. In fact, our historical relations they date back to several centuries, going back to the days of the Cholas, who exercised their influence across today's Indonesia. You can find that historical presence even today through the Hindu and Buddhist linkages that bind India and Indonesia together. And also look at the people to people relations that we enjoy. Both countries are located in the same crucial corridor and they have some common interests in the Indo Pacific, from common economic interests to defense and security interests. Indonesia remains a key supplier of coal and hydrocarbons, and as well as key minerals and palm oil to India. India has key exports towards Indonesia. Indian workers play a big role in Indonesian economy. So there are a lot of opportunities that are available. And it is this relationship which has now been prioritized under the Act East policy and the Mahasagar doctrine. Prime Minister Modi was given a grand reception. Prime Minister Modi was also awarded one of the highest honors given out by the Indonesian government. He was given a chance to address the Indonesian parliament as well. And in the maritime security and defense domain, a lot of key agreements have been signed. And as well as in the field of minerals, important deals and agreements have been announced. And that is what we will take a look at. So, first, let's look at the deals regarding minerals and key raw materials. Indonesia is blessed with rare earth reserves, hydrocarbon reserves, and key minerals, especially the Indonesian side of Borneo, the Kalimantan province, and the Sulawesi island. These regions are known to have rich deposits of rare earths, which can be used in producing rare earth magnets, which have a critical application in automobiles, in defense, in aerospace. So, India and Indonesia have signed an agreement for cooperation in non ferrous materials and to jointly work together for the production of rare earth magnets. In the steel sector, a joint venture will be set up along with reliable supply chain for critical minerals and key raw materials that could meet the demands of the Indian industry, especially critical emerging technologies from AI to electric vehicles and batteries. Then, looking at the defense and security sector. See, Indonesia had already given access to the strategic Sabang port to the Indian Navy. The Sabang port, which is located at the northern tip of Sumatra, it overlooks the Malacca Strait, and Indian Navy had already been given access to it. Given the fact that India already has a tri-service command at Andaman Nicobar Islands, this enhanced military presence and access to a key port facility, it enhanced the operational reach of the Indian Navy towards the Malacca Strait and South China Sea. And now both countries have signed an agreement which will allow India to play a role in the upgradation and development of the Sabang port. It will sit right next to the Great Nicobar project that India is planning, and it allows India to exercise its influence and dominance at the opening of the Malacca Strait. Along with that, both countries have signed an agreement on maritime safety and security cooperation, along with key defense exports, which are being operationalized. Before we talk about the defense exports, you should also note that Indonesian Navy will be deploying a liaison officer at IFC IOR. What is IFC IOR? It stands for Information Fusion Center for Indian Ocean region. It's a national command, control and intelligence headquarters located on the outskirts of Delhi in Gurugram, operated by Indian Navy, where all the radar data of India's coastal radar network is integrated. After the 26/11 Mumbai attacks, India executed the Coastal Surveillance Radar Project. In phase one, the entire coastline of India from Gujarat to West Bengal was covered, including the island territories of Lakshadweep and Andaman Nicobar. In phase two, we have extended these radars to friendly countries in Indian Ocean like Mauritius, Seychelles, and the others. So today, India has a complete picture of the movement of vessels across the Indian Ocean from East Africa and Gulf of Aden towards Malacca Strait. So this center has become so pivotal that many foreign navies, the friendly countries, they are stationing their liaison officers to coordinate with Indian Navy and exchange intelligence and to monitor white shipping that passes through the Indian Ocean. This is where important sea lanes of communication are located. So Indonesian Navy will be deploying a liaison officer which enhances the maritime naval intelligence coordination between the two navies. Now coming back to defense exports, India is all set to supply Indonesia with BrahMos, the world's fastest, one of the most accurate supersonic cruise missile. It has recently established its battle worthiness during Operation Sindoor against Pakistan. Philippines became the first country that received BrahMos from India. And India has been stepping up the export opportunities for BrahMos. Vietnam is also reportedly in talks, and it's one of the contenders to buy BrahMos from India. This strengthens our indigenous defense industry, boosts defense exports. It also marks a big transformation from India being a defense importing nation to a defense exporting country. And it strengthens the domestic efforts to focus on new age defense technologies. Plus, Indonesia has also signed a deal for procuring the Astra BVRM, the Beyond Visual Range Air to Air Missile, which will be mounted on the Sukhoi fighter jets. Just like Indian Air Force operates the Sukhoi 30 from Russia, Indonesian Air Force also operates the Sukhoi fighter jets. And the indigenously developed and produced Astra air to air missile would be very soon sold to Indonesia as well. So, this is India's way of strengthening the partners in the ASEAN region and countering China in its own backyard. If China can arm India's neighbors like Pakistan and the others and counter India in our own backyard in the Indian Ocean, so can India. India can do the same and counter China's interests in its own backyard. So when China supplied BrahMos to Philippines, it has anti-ship capabilities. It is primarily used for coastal defense as well. So this is a clear message with regard to Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. So India supplying the BrahMos to Indonesia and probably in the future to Vietnam will significantly enhance the presence of Indian weapon systems, which are mainly oriented towards countering Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. Then, in the cultural domain, one of the standout uh, features of this visit was that Prime Minister Modi visited the historic Prambanan temple complex at Yogyakarta. This is a 1,000 plus year old temple complex dating back to the 9th, 10th century, built by the then Hindu Buddhist kingdoms that existed over today's Indonesia. And it's a massive temple complex dedicated to Lord Shiva and as well as to Vishnu and Brahma. It was discovered much, much later, very recently, a century ago. And India is going to play a role in reviving and upgrading the temple site, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. In fact, India has engaged in such diplomacy, cultural diplomacy across Southeast Asian countries. We have helped countries like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and even Myanmar to upgrade some of the historical Hindu Buddhist temples that form a living link, a cultural link between the two civilizations. So these were some of the standout outcomes, the key outcomes of the Prime Minister's visit to Indonesia. When you look at the visit to Australia, there were equally important outcomes. See, Australia is a natural partner. Both are democratic nations, multicultural societies, vibrant economies on both sides, and we have common security threats and concerns. We have a very strong Indian community in Australia, lakhs of Indian students and workers contributing to the Australian economy and sending remittances back home to India. They form the living bridge that bind India and Australia together. Recently, both countries have elevated the relationship to comprehensive strategic partnership in 2020. In 2022, we even signed a free trade agreement, the ECTA, Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement. We have common concerns with regard to piracy and terrorism in the Indo Pacific, and as well as Chinese aggression, or be it cybersecurity threats or disruption of supply chains. All the threats that India experiences, the same threats are shared by Australia as well. So there is a natural partnership between the two sides. And during the visit of the Prime Minister, both sides have brought out a joint declaration on enhanced defense and security cooperation. We are already part of the Malabar exercise, which is a multilateral naval exercise hosted by India along with Japan, US, and Australia. The four Quad nations, they have a parallel naval military exercise called the Malabar. India, Australia, they're also part of many bilateral military exercises, including Austra Hind. Australia also invites Indian armed forces for various multilateral military exercises. So there is a strong coordination and interoperability that exists between the Indian and Australian defense forces. We have close intelligence sharing and coordination as well. So now, both countries have brought out a maritime security collaboration roadmap to deal with the threats present in the Indo Pacific, from organized crime, such as drug trafficking, arms trafficking, to piracy, to terrorism, all the threats that affect the Indo Pacific, the peace and stability in the region. They have been identified as a common ground where India Australia will collaborate. And more importantly, we also have a 2+2 ministerial dialogue between our foreign ministers and defense ministers, which was set up a few years ago. We've also signed a logistics exchange agreement that allows the armed forces of both countries to make use of their military facilities for refueling, for servicing and maintenance, which enhances their operational reach. And during the visit, both countries have signed an agreement to promote collaboration between the Indian Coast Guard and the Maritime Border Command of Australia. The focus would be on disaster management assistance, providing HADR support or humanitarian assistance and disaster relief to countries in Indo-Pacific which could be affected by disasters. Let's say a cyclone were to hit Sri Lanka or a tsunami were to hit Indonesia. Both Indian Navy, Australian Navy could coordinate in these HADR operations. They will also work together in search and rescue operations to save life at sea. And they have a common stake in patrolling the waters, in deterring any threats, and extending relief to the affected nations. So, all these areas of defense cooperation have been prioritized with these new agreements that were signed. Then, coming to energy cooperation, Australia is blessed with resources. It is blessed with hydrocarbons, and it can be one of the reliable suppliers of liquid fuels, which can guarantee India's energy security. So, in this regard, an agreement was signed. And more importantly, in the nuclear domain, India Australia already had signed a civil nuclear deal. See, Australia has the world's largest known uranium reserves. Can you guess which country is the world's largest producer of uranium? Can you let me know in the comments? Australia has the world's largest known reserves of uranium. So please find out which country is the world's largest producer of uranium. So Australia can be a reliable supplier to fuel India's civilian nuclear program. Now, with India's Shanti Act, India has liberalized its nuclear sector, allowed private sector investments, foreign investments, and we are focusing on small modular reactors. And we need large supplies of uranium to focus on the three-stage nuclear program of India. So, Australia can be that reliable supplier that can help India achieve energy independence, which will also help bring down our emissions, meet our climate targets, and transition to cleaner fuels and reduce our dependency on hydrocarbons. So this deal will go a long way. It will build upon the India-Australia civil nuclear agreement, and Australia will become one of the key partners to supply uranium. This comes in the backdrop of a similar deal with Canada as well. Canada also has large reserves of uranium, and Australia, Canada can become two important reliable suppliers of uranium. Then, coming to the critical emerging technologies, Australia, India have signed the PACTS, the PACTS, Partnership for Cyber Critical Technologies and Supply Chains. Australia is a leader in cybersecurity, and India has a common interest to share each other's experience, learn from each other, and focus on critical technologies, including artificial intelligence, semiconductors, advanced forms of communication, including 6G networks, open RAN communication protocols, and as well as quantum computing. We're also focusing on space collaboration between our space agencies. So, all these key areas of technology have been identified as areas of partnership. Then, India Australia are looking to strengthen global supply chains. We are already part of the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, along with Japan, which is a trilateral initiative. So, India Australia have signed this agreement to strengthen the supply chain of key minerals and raw materials and assist each other in the pursuit of critical technologies and emerging technologies. Then, another interesting outcome was a trilateral agreement between India, Australia, and Canada on technology and innovation partnership, where Australia and Canada will work with India in training, in sharing of expertise, in sharing of knowledge, in helping India to focus on key areas of technology and innovation. So, this was the other important agreement that was signed. Along with this, there were many deals in the field of education, healthcare. The same was the case with Indonesia as well, in the field of education and healthcare. Then, in the field of mining, Australia, which is blessed with minerals, is a global leader in mining technology. It will work with Indian institutions to set up a center of excellence in mining technology and mining services to build India's capabilities in the mining sector. And Australia has also strengthened the cultural engagement with India by voluntarily repatriating Indian artifacts. For example, the Nandi trident, along with the auspicious Bhadrakali. and the six-headed Skanda or the Kartikeya, with several other ancient medieval artifacts that were taken out of India, have been voluntarily returned to restore India's cultural heritage. This is something India is pursuing through its diplomatic efforts as well, and Australia has been doing it voluntarily, which is a clear sign of the close cultural ties that we share. And India is opening up access to its traditional knowledge digital library. India has set up a digital database that documents traditional indigenous knowledge held by our indigenous and tribal communities, our agrarian communities. So, this will help to counter any biopiracy attempts. It will help protect intellectual property and counter any biopiracy attempts and prevent any litigations coming up between Australian companies which might be innovating. And if it were to clash with India's indigenous traditional knowledge, it could help counter the claims of IP and protect the traditional rights of India's indigenous communities. So, as you can see, the visit to Australia was one of the most productive. It has taken the relationship to the next level. And India had one major concern about the presence of Khalistani outfits. And Australia has promised to coordinate with India, share intelligence, and crack down on Khalistani outfits that have made a presence in Australian cities. Because in the last few years, we have seen that in Sydney, in Melbourne, in Brisbane, there have been targeted campaigns aimed against India by Khalistani outfits. So, cracking down on Khalistani elements is a top priority in the security domain. Now, coming to the final visit to New Zealand. This is the first visit by an Indian Prime Minister in more than 4 decades. So, during the visit, India and New Zealand have elevated the relationship to strategic partnership with a roadmap till 2030. They have signed several key deals stretching across defense, economic relations, trade, cultural ties, education, etc. So let's take a quick look at the outcomes. India and New Zealand have signed an agreement for defense cooperation between their armed forces with special focus on maritime security. They have also established a maritime security dialogue so that both the navies can regularly exchange information and coordinate their operations in the Indo Pacific region. Now, please remember, New Zealand is part of the Five Eyes Alliance. It's an intelligence collective of five Western democracies led by US, which includes UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So India already has very close security ties with Australia and New Zealand. And given the fact that they are part of this intelligence collective, it could play a big role in helping India to deal with the mutual threats, especially with regard to counterterrorism. So the growing defense relations between India and New Zealand is a new development. Until now, our ties were largely focused on economic ties and cultural ties. So now we have elevated the relationship to strategic partnership level and we are prioritizing defense, intelligence sharing, maritime security. New Zealand has also signed a mutual logistics exchange agreement where the defense forces, particularly the navies, can access the naval facilities of each other, which enhances their operational reach. So these were some of the important outcomes in the field of maritime security. With regard to counterterrorism, New Zealand has promised intelligence sharing and coordination, primarily to tackle Khalistani outfits, which have made a presence in New Zealand as well. In the last 2, 3 years, we have seen repeated protests and rallies by Khalistani extremists in New Zealand, just like in Australia. So, countering the Khalistani threat remains a top priority for India across these countries. And the initiative on counterterrorism and intelligence exchange would help satisfy those interests for India. Then, coming to the hydrography domain, where underwater cartography is carried out, the sea floor is mapped out, which helps in deployment of naval ships and submarines, which will help in exploring the minerals or resources found on the sea floor. India and New Zealand have signed an agreement to coordinate in the field of nautical cartography to map out the sea floor across the Indo Pacific, share the hydrography data and the maps, the navigational charts, which will help Indian Navy to easily deploy its warships and submarines far beyond the Indian Ocean. And we have also entered into an arrangement under the Indo Pacific Oceans Initiative. This is an India led initiative which was launched back in 2019 at the East Asia Summit. So several important powers of the Indo-Pacific and even beyond the Indo-Pacific have joined this initiative. It has seven key pillars of cooperation. It includes maritime security, disaster management assistance, etc. So New Zealand has specifically joined the security pillar, for cooperating in the domain of countering illegal fishing or unreported, unregulated fishing, which is a major threat, which essentially threatens the rights over your exclusive economic zone. So both countries will coordinate with each other to counter and tackle illegal fishing that could happen in your EEZ. Then, with regard to trade and economy, India and New Zealand have recently signed an FTA. The India New Zealand FTA was announced last year, signed just a few months ago in April 2026. It is all set to take effect very soon. Under this trade agreement, both sides are giving duty free access to most of their exports. It will create significant opportunities, especially for India's labor intensive sectors like textiles, leather, furniture, pharmaceuticals, and the others, and could create jobs in India. It could drive further market access for India's MSME industry, agriculture sector, and even IT and services. And what is really interesting about this FTA is that it provides opportunity for easier migration of Indian students and professionals, and as well as Ayush practitioners, which promotes traditional alternate medicine. So the trade potential right now is not completely utilized. The bilateral trade volume is hardly around $3 billion. So both countries have set a goal by signing this agreement to double the bilateral trade to $7 billion by the end of the decade by fully utilizing the potential of the FTA, which is going to take effect very soon. Then, in the field of agriculture, New Zealand will be helping India in cultivation of the kiwi fruit. It will set up two centers of excellence in Nagaland and Uttarakhand to help Indian farmers diversify into different crops to increase their income opportunities. And in the dairy and agriculture sector, New Zealand is a global leader when it comes to animal husbandry and dairy. It produces one of the finest quality of milk and milk products. So India has ensured to protect this sensitive sector in the FTA. Agriculture and dairy and animal husbandry, these sectors are protected with existing tariffs under the FTA. But New Zealand will help India in technology and sharing expertise to strengthen our dairying industry. Along with that, deals have been signed in the field of tourism, in the field of space cooperation, even in the field of sport. New Zealand is a leader in sport medicine, sports sciences. It can help train Indian athletes, especially in sports like rugby, for example. So there's a lot of interest on both the sides to promote sports cooperation as well. So this is a clear illustration of how India's ties with New Zealand have been transforming over the recent years. Then both countries have even signed an agreement to focus on polar research. New Zealand could become the Norway for India, because when it comes to Arctic research in the North Pole, Norway is the pivot for us. Norway is the one which gives us that access to the Arctic region where most of our research projects are concentrated and routed through Norway. So similarly, New Zealand could play that role with regard to South Pole. India already has multiple research facilities, and we are in the process of setting up a new research station in the Antarctic. So New Zealand will become that key partner and focus on polar studies, oceanic research, climate change studies, etc. So all these deals and agreements were signed. So as you can see, this visit was not just about projecting our military and security influence. It goes far beyond that. It's about economic relations, cultural ties, access to minerals, access to key resources and raw materials. So this will definitely project India's all-round influence, economic, military, and diplomatic. It'll cement India's position as a key power of the Indo Pacific, and it drives our Act East policy and the Mahasagar Doctrine. Mahasagar stands for Mutual and Holistic Advancement of Security and Growth Across Regions. It was launched last year in 2025. It is an upgraded version of the Sagar Doctrine that was launched earlier in 2015. Under Sagar Doctrine, security and growth for all in the region, India mainly prioritized only the Indian Ocean region. So, with Mahasagar, we have expanded the vision to cover the entire Indo Pacific and drive close economic ties and security relations with all the major powers of the Indo Pacific. In Act East policy, the Southeast East Asian countries are the focus. Mahasagar gives it a wider coverage, a wider geographical reach, and it cements India's key position as an economic, military, and diplomatic partner for Indo Pacific countries. So, this influence will definitely help counter Chinese aggression and Chinese influence in the Indo Pacific. China's growing aggression in South China Sea, its growing disputes with Taiwan, with Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, its disputes with Japan as well. It brings into concern, it brings the concern about rules based order and how free and open nature of Indo Pacific is being disrupted by Chinese aggression, and how China has been encircling India through its so called string of pearls strategy and its BRI investments under the Belt and Road Initiative. China has reached out even to South Pacific. It has a big presence across Southeast and East Asia region, stretching towards the Indian Ocean. Almost all the economies here are heavily dependent on China for trade, for investments, for technology. Even countries like Indonesia, countries like Australia, they have a lot of trade and import dependency on China. Even with regard to key technologies, key intermediaries, they're all heavily dependent on China, just like India. So, reducing this vulnerability, diversifying the supply chains, building resilient supply chains to move away from China dependency is the common goal of India, Indonesia, Australia, and New Zealand. So, definitely, these visits of the Prime Minister will aid in achieving the vision of Act East and Mahasagar. But, however, there are some serious challenges in the way ahead. China, with its incredible influence, with its massive investments, with its military reach, it can continue to dominate this region. See, for example, in the South Pacific, you have small island nations next to Australia and New Zealand, such as Solomon Islands, for example. China has already signed security deals with them. It has pushed massive investments through Belt and Road Initiative. Chinese Navy has been building up its naval presence, including submarine presence in the South Pacific. That is what causes serious concern for Australia. That explains why it has entered into the AUKUS deal with UK and United States, where UK and US are helping Australia to procure nuclear submarine technology. Nuclear powered submarine technology is being passed from US and UK to Australia to set up Australia as a deterrent against Chinese military expansion in the region. So, this growing Chinese presence will pose a challenge for India because you can't expect Indonesia or New Zealand or Australia to overnight shift their allegiance or end their dependencies on China. This is true across the region. Even countries like, let's say, Philippines or Vietnam, though they have standing disputes, though they have ongoing aggressive tensions with China, they still remain economically dependent on China. So that's a reality we can't change overnight. Plus, you have an unreliable United States under Donald Trump. As I told you, US has recently renamed the Indo-Pacific Command, one of its most important military command, as the Pacific Command. So this is like a reversal of American policy. It's a signal that US probably doesn't consider Indian Ocean and India to be that important. Back during Obama's administration, the focus was to loop in India as a counterbalance to China. That's when the American vision expanded towards Indo Pacific. And the Pacific Command had been renamed as Indo Pacific Command, which was a signal, a gesture towards India to highlight the growing prominence of the Indian Ocean and the role of India in stabilizing the Indo Pacific. So now, with Trump deprioritizing the Quad, in the last 2+ years, no Quad summit has taken place. India was supposed to host the next Quad summit and it has been waiting. And given Trump's statements targeting India, the trade wars aimed at India, there is a complete unreliability which has crept into this relationship. And this poses a serious challenge for India because you can't rely on American support and influence to counter China all the time. And that explains why India is moving ahead in the region and creating its own parallel architecture, working bilaterally with countries like Japan, Australia, Indonesia, New Zealand, Philippines, and the others. And what is interesting is that just few days before PM Modi carried out the three nation visit, Japan's Prime Minister Sane Takaichi was in India focusing on maritime security, focusing on stabilizing the Indo-Pacific, promoting the vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific. So this perfectly aligns with India's goals and India's initiatives. So way forward would be for India to step up its economic engagement in the region. The Act East policy should be aimed at driving India's market access into these countries to boost our exports, create more jobs, and also secure key resources and raw materials so that we can reduce dependency on China controlled supply chains. Then step up our technological collaboration from defense technology to critical emerging technologies. Again, to reduce dependency on China controlled supply chains. And further would be to step up defense military engagement and as well as India's investments in key development projects across the region. These initiatives will have to continue. So if you look at India's engagement here, especially in South Pacific, we are working closely with the Pacific Island countries and a forum which India has set up with South Pacific Island nations called the FIPIC, the Forum for India and the Pacific Island countries. So here India enjoys a natural influence with small island nations like Fiji, which have a strong Indian community. These are the descendants of the Indian laborers who were transported by the British during the colonial period. So India exercises a natural influence in the South Pacific, and India is stepping up that influence through investments and assistance and disaster relief that we are providing to all the countries over here. So India will have to continue with this engagement under Act East and Mahasagar Doctrine. And these visits will definitely add that momentum into this vision of India. So on this note, I bring this discussion to an end. Let me know what you think about PM Modi's three-nation visit. There was one single mission, which was to achieve India's immediate priorities, economic priorities, military priorities, and diplomatic priorities. So do you think it was a successful visit? Do you think it will help counter China? Let me know in the comments. That is it. Thanks for watching.